The triage spire of Kesvanter Station hummed with pale blue bioluminescence, and Chief Medical Adjudicator Veskorin drifted through it on a cushion of pressurized gel, her translucent, bell-shaped body pulsing violet with clinical urgency, as three trembling Yulkir crewmen were fed into the resonance chamber behind her. Their exoskeletons cracked open like eggshells from a reactor flare that had, by any reasonable measure, already killed them. Veskorin's kind didn't have blood exactly. They had a circulatory gel that changed hue with stress, running from a resting cerulean to a screaming magenta in the space of a heartbeat she didn't technically have. Right now, she was somewhere between plum and panic. Triage Protocol 7 Ash, she called, her voice a wet chime translated through the collar unit clipped to what passed for her collarbone. Prioritize Resilience Index 4 and above. Anything below a 2 is administrative loss. We do not spend gel on the dying. This was the whole philosophy of the Curia Medica, codified 2,000 years ago in the 11 Laws of Fragile Flesh. Resources are finite, biology is destiny, and no species survives what its resilience index says it can't. The laws had never once been wrong. They were, in fact, the reason the Curia ran triage on 41 worlds without ever running out of gel. Which was why nobody was paying the human any attention. He was parked in the intake corridor on an equipment crate, a lanky, sunburned specimen named Corporal Danny Halloran, filling out a supply requisition form on a scavenged data slate with his offhand, because his other arm had a compound fracture in it that was visibly tinting the skin. He was also chewing something. Gum, it would turn out later, though nobody asked at the time because nobody thought there'd be a later worth discussing. "Hey," he said, to no one in particular, "is there a vending thing on this station, or—" "You are bleeding," said the intake drone hovering near him, in the flat tone of something that had never had to say this to a patient still filling out paperwork. "Yeah," Halloran agreed, not looking up. "I'll get to it." It was the shrug that did it. Veskorin caught it from across the corridor, the particular loose, unbothered roll of the shoulders a creature makes when it has decided its own compound fracture is somebody else's problem to worry about, and something about it snagged in her memory banks like a burr. She drifted closer, chromatophores rippling into a curious teal. "Soldier, your resilience index is on file as fragile tier, category 2. You understand what you're describing, filling out logistics forms while your radius is exposed to open air, is a violation of expected pain response for your classification." Halloran glanced at his arm like he'd forgotten it was attached to him. "Oh, this. Yeah, it's not the bone part that hurts, it's the itching under the splint once you finally get one on. Bones are fine. Bones don't really feel anything. There's no nerves in there really, it's all just," he waved the pen vaguely, "outside stuff." Veskorin's bell went a shade of violet that had no clean translation. "Outside stuff." "Skin mostly." "You are describing catastrophic skeletal trauma as a minor inconvenience relative to itching." "I mean, when you put it that way it sounds worse than it is." The resonance ward was where the Curia kept its actual believers, physicians who had spent centuries proving the 11 laws held up under every species they'd ever catalogued, from the silicate-boned Thren to the four-hearted Asuvari, whose entire circulatory system would liquefy under a tenth of the G-force humans apparently considered turbulence. It was here that Vescorin brought Halloran's file, and here that things stopped being merely irritating and started being a problem. "Pull his service record," she told the ward's junior clerk, a spindly translator plant named Rel whose stalk went rigid with alarm at almost everything, which made it excellent at conveying alarm and useless at conveying anything else. "I want to know how this individual is still assembled." Rel's vine stiffened into a bristling fan as the record loaded. "Adjudicator. There's rather a lot." Summarize. 11 months ago, Corporal Halloran was recorded working an external hull breach for 41 seconds in vacuum without a sealed suit to manually reroute a coolant valve before the emergency team could reach him. Vescorin's bell flushed a deep, disbelieving indigo. 41 seconds of hard vacuum should liquefy the vitreous humor and collapse the alveolar structure of any oxygen-breathing organism inside of 9. "He reported it gave him a nosebleed," said Rel. "That is not a survivable exposure." "He also," Rel continued, vines trembling harder now, "walked 11 kilometers on a fractured femur over the course of 3 days during the perimeter 12. Retreat because," and this is a direct quote from the incident log, "the truck had already left." A fractured femur is a mobility-ending injury in 96% of known bipedal species. He filed it as a training scar. He didn't report the fracture at all until it had already begun healing wrong, at which point he asked the medic to, quote, "re-break it so it sets straight," and then walked out of the tent afterward. Vescorin's chromatophores cycled so fast through the spectrum they briefly stuttered into a color the translator collar didn't have a word for. "You understand what you're describing is a level of self-inflicted trauma tolerance we associate exclusively with species that have ceased to feel pain altogether." "He feels it," Rel said. "He just told the medic it was annoying." "Get me the human himself, and get me Actuary Prime Ostena. I want numbers before I believe any of this." The actuarial deck smelled, if smell was the right sense for it, like ozone and correction fluid, and it was here that Actuary Prime Ostena lived among stacked probability lattices, an insectoid statistician whose 4 articulated forelimbs clicked together audibly whenever a data set displeased her, which, as it turned out, was constantly, once Halloran's file was open in front of her. Her mandibles clicked twice, sharp and dry, like a bone snapping in miniature. "This casualty profile does not compute against any resilience index we maintain." "Try," said Vescorin. Ostena's compound eyes flickered through the record, and her mandibles clicked a third time, harder. "Vacuum exposure survival for fragile tier organisms sits at 0.03% past the 20-second mark. He is logged past 40. Ambulation on a fractured load-bearing bone without medical intervention has a success rate, across our full sample of 11,000 recorded cases, of 0. We have no surviving comparison, adjudicator, because Every prior organism who attempted it died of shock or infection before completing 1 kilometer, let alone 11. There's more, Rel said miserably, vines drooping now instead of stiffening, as though even the plant had run out of alarm to spend. 6 months prior to the femur incident, he donated a full transfusion unit of blood to a wounded Thren engineer on the same day he'd taken shrapnel to the shoulder, then reported for a double-duty shift the next morning because, quote, someone had to cover for Garcia. Astena's forelimbs clicked in a rapid, almost panicked rhythm. Donating blood volume while already blood deficient carries a mortality risk in Category 2 organisms of approximately 61%. He experienced this as an inconvenience to his sleep schedule. By now Halloran had been retrieved from the intake corridor, arm finally splinted, and was sitting in the actuarial deck looking mostly bored, occasionally flexing his splinted fingers like he was testing a rental car. So, Vescorin said, drifting close enough that her gel cushion cast a violet shimmer across his face, you understand what you are describing across this record is, cumulatively, a set of survival events so statistically improbable that our models assign your species less than a 1 in 400,000 chance of producing even a single individual who could perform one of them, let alone all 3. Halloran thought about it, chewing his gum. 400,000's not that big a number when there's 8 billion of us. Silence. Vescorin's bell drained entirely of color, going a translucent, thoughtless white, the closest thing her biology had to shock. Astena's mandibles stopped clicking altogether, which was somehow worse than the clicking. You mean to say, Astena finally managed, that events we classify as statistical impossibilities occur routinely within your population, simply because your population is large enough to absorb the odds. I mean, I know like 4 other guys who have done weirder stuff than me, Halloran said. I'm not even the guy you want. You should meet Sergeant Okonkwo. She ran a marathon on a stress fracture because she'd already paid the registration fee. Rel's vines went so rigid they audibly creaked. The central curia chamber was where the 11 laws had been recited unbroken for 2 millennia, carved into a wall of black resin behind the tribunal dais. And it was here that Vescorin stood to deliver, for the first time in her adjudicating career, a formal amendment. The laws of fragile flesh, she announced, bell cycling through a color that finally settled somewhere between exhausted and reverent, assumed that pain response correlates to survival strategy, that a species which feels trauma acutely will also behave according to that trauma. This assumption is void for classification. Human. What's your revised index for them? Asked a tribunal elder from the gallery, itself something segmented and slow-moving that D sat through 400 years of these proceedings, without once needing to interrupt. Vescorin looked, briefly, at Halloran, who was in the back of the chamber trying to work out whether the vending unit took curia scrip or actual currency. We don't have one, she said. We're proposing a new tier above Resilience 4. We're calling it stubborn. Someone asked Halloran, before he left the chamber, whether he had anything to say about the record he'd apparently set, the policy he'd apparently rewritten, The 400 years of medical doctrine he'd apparently put a crack through. He thought about it for a second, longer than he'd thought about any of the injuries. "Pain's just information," he said. "It's not an instruction. You're allowed to listen to it without doing what it says." Nobody in the chamber had a chromatophore response prepared for that one. It just sat there, quiet and true, and even Rel's vines went still. The requisitions bay was loud and unglamorous, full of crates and the low whine of a loading crane. And it was here, 20 minutes after being reclassified as a walking violation of 400 years of alien medicine, that Corporal Danny Halloran wandered off toward his next assignment. A coolant leak on Deck 9 that somebody needed to reseal by hand before it reached the reactor housing. Still splinted, still chewing the same piece of gum. Entirely unaware that he had just become a footnote the Curia Medica would study for the next 2 centuries. The official incident report, filed by Actuary Prime Ostena and forwarded to all 41 member worlds, ended with a line that would outlive everyone in that chamber. Recommend immediate revision of resilience classifications for species, human, sample size, insufficient, explanation, insufficient, recommend further study. Recommend also that no one inform the subject how improbable he is. He does not appear to require the information, and giving it to him will likely only make him more difficult to supervise.